Welcome to our Open High Streets event this morning that we're running on behalf of the Architectural Heritage Fund, where we'll hopefully find out if historic buildings can be the saviours of our high streets. I'm Bev Gormley and I'm the Programme Manager for the Heritage Trust Network, and we're the UK's umbrella body for groups, organisations, and people who are rescuing and restoring historic buildings, structures and spaces. We've got some fantastic speakers lined up for you this morning, and I'll be handing over to our CEO, David Tittle, in just a second. I'll be in the background covering the chat box, and there'll be time for questions towards the end of the event. So please do post your questions there. And also at the end, you can use the reactions button to raise a hand if you'd like to speak. The usual Zoom etiquette applies this morning, so please stay on mute if you can. And as this event is being recorded, because we want to share it with as wide an audience as possible, turn your webcam off if you don't want to appear. And also the best view really when we've got presentations is speaker view, if you click on the little view button on the top right. Also, if you look in the top left corner of your screen, you'll see that we're using Otter AI, which is a live speech to text transcript service, as we want to try and make our webinars and meetings as accessible as possible. So feel free to use that. All you do is click on it and it will bring up a separate screen where you can actually see the words that are being spoken. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to David to kick this morning off.
And I shall unmute and say thank you, Bev, and welcome everybody. It's really great to see so many people at this event from so many different organisations and backgrounds. I think Bev forgot to mention that we're delivering this in partnership with Locality. Unusually, we don't have anybody speaking from Locality at this event, but they are our partners in the programme. And if you paid for your ticket today, it means you're not a member of either the Heritage Trust Network or Locality. So you really should consider joining one or both of them. And we both have a free class of membership amongst our classes of membership. So there's no excuses for not joining, really. Okay, so today is about historic buildings, high street heroes. We're returning to the question of the uses to which we put high street buildings, and looking particularly today through a cultural lens. And we're looking at the special role that historic buildings can play in facilitating different uses. This event, if it hadn't been for certain things happening out there, this event was supposed to be in Coventry. I very much hope, I'm not going to promise because we've made promises like that before, but I very much hope that this was the last one of these events that is only online. Our future events will all include an online element so people can access them from anywhere, or if they're nervous about traveling or whatever. But I'm hoping that the future events, there will be an in-person version that you can come to that will include site visits and those, you know, lovely chances to network. So in the absence of you all being in Coventry, I'm going to talk a little bit about Coventry. Later, Carol's going to talk about the specifics of the High Street has and the City of Culture in Coventry. But I wanted to talk more generally and talk about the use of the term high street in common parlance. For example, when it comes up in the news, I think it's used in two overlapping and sometimes a bit confusing ways. It's used as a synonym for town, city and neighbourhood centres, and it's also used as a synonym for retail. So when they say, you know, the failing high street, what they sometimes mean is the failing retail or failing town centres. But I think there's a third, more specific and accurate use of the term high street, and that is as a particular urban form found throughout our city, town and neighbourhood centres. And that form is very simple. It's so simple we take it for granted that active uses face each other across a street, which is the sort of central street of a city, town or neighbourhood. And whether that street includes vehicles or is pedestrianised, it's the same formula. And it's that frequently changing mix of uses which is dependent on a mix of adaptable buildings in those high streets. And the form which intensifies activity by using two sides of the street and adding a travel corridor. So as people involved in heritage, I think we have to take the long view. This urban form of the high street is enduringly successful over centuries. Some high streets have difficult times, but they show themselves capable of bouncing back because of their urban form. To come back to Coventry, if I think of the successful neighbourhood centres in Coventry, and I can think of 4 of them, regardless of the socio-economic or ethnic mix of the residents, those successful centres all take the form of high streets, where that mix of old buildings, not necessarily of great architectural quality or individual heritage value, allows for a variety of uses, and the fact that they're facing each other across a through route adds to intensity. Where centres were subject to 20th century development, redevelopment, the high street form was abandoned in favour of sort of pedestrianised squares and mini precincts that took activity off the main thoroughfare. And as I look around Coventry, I can see that they all failed. And later in the 20th and early 21st century, we saw the growth of out-of-town retail centres, of sheds built around car parks. And now we see some of those beginning to fail. About 13 years ago, a comprehensive redevelopment of Coventry city centre was proposed, just 60 years after the last one. And one of the reasons given at that time is that the city did not have the type of retail units with a double height front and a deep floor plate that the retailers said that they needed in order to succeed. And at that time, it seemed like the retail boom would last forever. So what was being proposed was to rip up and rebuild urban infrastructure that should have been there for centuries to accommodate a social and economic trend that was lasted a couple of decades. So I'm not going to come to a conclusion there. I'm going to let our speakers take up that theme of enduring forms, the high street heroes, and the changing uses. 2 timescales and how we get those 2 timescales to work together. So first we have Owain Lloyd-James, who's Head of Places Strategy at Historic England. Owain.
Thank you, David. And I'll just try and share my screen, but annoyingly, I found that sufficiently interesting that I completely forgot I was speaking. So it'll take me a couple of minutes to sort myself out. Here we go. Yes, and they're just building on what David just said. There we go. I think it's interesting that how easy it is to go back to the front, to tell the health of a place from just looking at the high street, and how the high street can tell you so much about the wider area. Its success, its affluence, the strength of its community, just through the one location. But no, I should start on what I'm supposed to be saying now. Yes, I'm Owain Lloyd-James. I'm Head of Places Strategy at Historic England. As a job title that means nothing to anyone else, but essentially I'm the strategic lead for our High Streets programme, and more of which later. Now, I see my role today as providing a bit of the big picture context stuff before we get onto the speakers who actually know what they're talking about and can talk about some really interesting and useful things, essentially the stuff you probably signed in today. But as for context, what I'll be covering is firstly what's happening on our high streets, outlining the move away from a retail heavy space that David just referred to one that offers a greater diversity of offer, and one that perhaps reflects better local need. Then moving on to the role of heritage in the future of these places. We know a lot is happening on high streets. We know both pre and post COVID, there have been these national level debates discussing their future. We have Grimsby reviews, High Street Task Force, Future High Streets Fund, etc., etc. But within all of that, why is heritage important? Effectively, why are we holding events like this to talk about heritage at our high streets? And then lastly, what's the need of intervention? A lot of time and money is spent on high streets at the moment. Why are we bothering? After all, we could just leave high streets to market forces. Why are we investing time and money in places that we seem to be visiting less? Here, I will also cover Historic England's own High Street Heritage Action Zones programme. This all, I hope, should seamlessly set up my fellow speakers. Well, that's the intention. Right. Now, we know that people are visiting high streets less, and certainly increasingly, we do our shopping elsewhere. This was the case pre-COVID, and the pandemic has served to hasten those existing trends. Online retail sales have grown steadily over the last decade and averaged 19.2% in 2019. With lockdown, online shopping boomed to 31.1% share in April and 32.8% in May, falling back to 28.1% in July. Now, it's unlikely we will see a return to pre-COVID levels. Many former high street shoppers will have shifted to online shopping permanently. In addition, as non-essential retail reopened, many stores did not and will not. The Centre of Retail Research has logged over 3,100 multiple shop losses between the 1st of January and the 5th of August 2020. COVID effectively accelerated existing trends of declining use of high street retail. So, if we aren't shopping on our high streets, why do we need them? Well, high streets had never ever been simply about shopping. The rise of the retail-heavy high street can probably be dated back to the 60s, but high streets have always contributed more than that to the places they serve. Now, think about the last time you visited your local high street. Why did you do that? Was it to go shopping, or was it to visit the doctors who might have seen the value of locating themselves on the high street, which has both access to parking and public transport? Was it to meet friends in a cafe or restaurant? Or was it to visit a museum or a library? Arts Council research shows the high proportion of cultural venues that just happen to be close to a high street. Successful high streets are a collection of different attractors that bring people to a place. That includes shops, but a lot more besides. And they bring together people in ways that are vital for supporting healthy and cohesive communities. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to dwell on this slide for too long. It's only here because the term is a popular one and comes up everywhere. And it reflects how retail, in particular high street retail, is adapting. So what is meant by the awful term experiential retail? Essentially, it means that retail, the retail that remains on high streets needs to offer an experience, not simply just turn up in a shop, make a purchase, then leave again. Shops need to provide something that can't be replicated elsewhere, but particularly to differentiate the experience of shopping online. That difference can take a number of different forms, such as a high quality customer service, to a highly localized offer or product, to the variety of different shops and services in a place, or perhaps the quality of the environment, both the building and the public spaces. And that nicely leads us on to, why is heritage important? Now, there are a lot of organisations, Historic England, the Architectural Heritage Fund, others represented here today, that are spending a lot of time and money focusing on high streets. Why? What is it that heritage has to offer these places that makes it important? Essentially, why are we all sitting around our laptops and screens today? Well, as the function of high streets shifts, and so fewer and fewer people feel they need to visit them to shop, increasingly, they need to become places where people choose to spend their leisure time. As that function shifts, the quality of the environment becomes more important. Their distinctiveness and local character has an increasing role to play in their success. High streets need to become places where people enjoy visiting. Now, we have a raft of evidence that connects heritage and improved commercial and business outcomes. On behalf of the heritage sector, Historic England publishes Heritage Counts, and that covers a wide-ranging research on the contribution heritage makes to places. Now, in 2018, we published The Past is the Foundation for Our Future, Heritage and Commercial Use, as you see from your screen at the moment, which contains a lot of research that is directly relevant to what we're talking about today. For example, there is evidence pointing to a growing link between heritage and business decision making. Between 2012 and 2018, listed buildings used for branded retail, food and drink, up by 173%, and listed buildings with branded retailers up by 154%. Now, this level of increase does not happen by accident. As I just mentioned, the function of our high streets is evolving. As a result, we're also seeing a shift in the behaviour of some significant players, and more specifically, how they see heritage and local character. Increasingly, those who operate on our high streets are seeing the benefits in the use of historic buildings. So, as high streets evolve, perhaps we're also seeing the evolution of how historic environment is used on the high street, with major brands seeing the benefit of being in a building with historic value or with its own character. There is value in distinctiveness and in that association with the historic environment and the place's heritage. So we can see evidence of a strong positive relation between the historic environment and a vibrant, sustainable commercial sector. Here, we've got 69% of commercial occupiers saying historic buildings give a positive image to customers and clients, and also that the quality of the historic environment is as important a factor as road access when businesses decide where to locate. Now that second bullet in particular is hugely significant. Again, we're seeing that value is being associated with historic places. Now, that value in the historic environment is manifested at two different levels, covered in these two previous slides. Firstly, at the level of the building, the value in occupying historic premises, the contribution that occupying a historic, distinct building has in attracting people to that building. And at the level of the place, the value in the historic character of the wider area, not just single buildings, but the public realm and how local character attracts people to the wider place, giving them the distinctiveness that can attract people to that place. But why is there a need for intervention? What is so important about our high streets? After all, we do have the internet. Well, when nurtured, high streets are the focus for local commerce, but also for the local community. They are places where businesses exist and can thrive, as well as one of the few places where people from all backgrounds meet and engage with each other. They represent a vital entry to the workplace for many at the start of their career, and for those returning to work after a career break. Their contribution to the success and feel of our cities, towns and villages is wide-ranging. Economically, high streets provide flexible employment for local people. They act as an incubator for small businesses and inject billions of pounds into the economy. Socially, research shows that for the most marginalised or isolated in society, such as the elderly, young people, newly arrived immigrants, and job seekers, a trip to the high street represents an important chance to meet others. They are key places for people new to an area, and in that way positively contribute to social cohesion. And culturally, and as I mentioned earlier, a large number of cultural assets such as theatres, libraries, museums and art galleries are located on high streets as areas of traditionally high footfall. As that footfall declines, so does the outlook for those cultural centres. Now, the importance of each of these factors is not diminished by a space with a reduced retail offer. The contribution is based around these spaces bringing people together, representing hubs for a local community. To quote the Ministry of Homes, Communities and Local Government, our high streets are where commerce and community meet. They are the barometers of prosperity and the heartbeats of the places we call home. So that is why we're intervening. Now, what is that intervention? So I'm just going to summarise the range of investment being directed the way of high streets before focusing more specifically on historic high streets. Now, Historic England's High Streets Heritage Action Loads programme, which I'll cover shortly, fits in with a larger picture of government investment in high streets. This is how everything hangs together. We have the Future High Streets Fund, which our high street has share an overarching investment objective and a definite definition of what a high street is, plans to focus on high street regeneration through investing in innovative proposals around transport, housing, delivery and public services. And because of that breadth of ambition, the funds available from the grants available from the Future High Street Funds far exceed anything that's available specifically to the historic environment. Now, within the Future High Streets Fund, We have Historic England, and we've been given £92 million from central government, plus £3 million from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. With the resources that Historic England is contributing to the programme, the total value is just short of £100 million. That represents the biggest ever single investment by government in the UK's built heritage, and gives some indication of the significance that High Street heritage has. And we also have the Architectural Heritage Fund's 15 million Transforming Places Through Heritage programme. And that's an asset-based scheme which supports charities and social enterprises to develop projects with the potential to bring new life to high streets by creating alternative uses for redundant or underused historic buildings in town centres. So, as promised, what are High Street's heritage action zones? Well, it's a 4-year programme using £95 million funding from government to the Heritage Fund. Historic England is providing grants of between 250,000 and 2 million in over 60 selected high street heritage action zones. The focus has been on projects that include an emphasis on local partnership and that support local regeneration and an increase in housing stock. Projects that have a positive, sustainable impact on the high street itself, but importantly on the wider area as well. And embedded into our programme is a cultural programme aimed at supporting local communities tell their stories, tell the stories of their places, producing specific site projects and celebrating local identity. Now, here are the investment objectives of the whole programme. So looking to change the perception of people, perception of the heritage in the high street, to support sustainable growth and to restore and enhance local character. Now, clearly, these are all linked. We are looking to bring people back to high streets by changing their perception of them through restoring their historic character. Now, reflecting the evidence outlined earlier, the programme is about using local heritage as a tool for wider benefits. Heritage as a driver for local growth. And by growth, I mean it in its widest sense. This links into the government's priority of addressing spatial inequality and regenerating struggling areas. And it's also reflected in how success of the programme will be assessed. Now, key to understanding the programme is how we plan to measure success. We're going wider than the traditional tools of just assessing intervention in heritage-focused activities. The key outcome indicators are footfall, vacancy rate, business diversity, public perceptions, along with socio-economic indicators. All are directly linked and consistent with how the Future High Streets Fund will be assessing even the impact of their investment. This will therefore give us a clear understanding of the impact of the total investment in high streets. Now, none of these indicators is heritage specific, but they speak to the wider success of the place as we use heritage focused investment as a tool for achieving those wider gains. As I mentioned earlier, we are directly working in over 67 high streets. This covers the whole of England from Maryport to Ramsgate and North Shields to Redruth. They reflect a wide variety of types of high streets in a wide variety of settings, with programmes developed to reflect those specific local conditions. Amongst those is Coventry, which was our demonstrator. They started work there a year early to allow their experience to shape the wider programme. And you'll be hearing more about that from Carol, and so I won't steal her thunder by using all her best lines. Now, as I mentioned earlier, embedded into each High Street Heritage Action Zones will be a cultural programme. The cultural programme will excite and engage the public, inspiring them to see high streets with fresh eyes, directly supporting the investment objectives of the wider programme.
Got 1 minute left, Owen.
Oh, blimey, cool, I'll speed up. Their purpose is to deliver activity on the public, for the public on every high street involved in the scheme, deliver activity for every year of the overall programme, support the capital programme by highlighting restoration works, supporting community cohesion by giving people a vehicle and reason to spend more time on their high street, and align with and support other national and local cultural programmes. But why? What's the point of a cultural programme? Well, there is evidence from places such as Hull and Liverpool that cultural programme encourages people to see these challenged areas in a new light, challenging the perception that the high street is dying or neglected. Instead, that these are places where communities come together. We need to bring people back to the high streets for reasons other than shopping. To do that, you're not just changing the place, you're changing people's perception of the place. That is how you shift places out of a cycle of decline. Now, I hope that was some use by way of context, and I've actually hit 15 minutes for the first time ever. And fingers crossed, this should seamlessly lead into our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Owain. I don't know how you fit so much information into that presentation in 15 minutes. That was brilliant. I'm going to now hand over to Carol Pyrah from Historic Coventry Trust, who are doing an amazing amount of work at the moment. So take it away, Carol.
Thank you very much, Bev. Okay, I'm just going to try and share my screen. Can you all see that?
We can.
Brilliant, thank you. So hello everybody, I'm Carol Pyrah, I'm the Executive Director of Historic Coventry Trust. And just to reassure those of you who attended the Heritage Trust Network event last September, I will be saying some new things in this presentation and giving an update on where we've got to in the last 9 months. So still stay on the call at this moment. Just to give you a bit of a background to Historic Coventry Trust, we're an entrepreneurial heritage development trust. We're one of the first cohort of heritage development trusts to be supported by the Architectural Heritage Fund. And we exist to bring new life to the city's heritage, finding innovative ways to sustain historic places and to inspire, involve and connect people with the city's history. We were actually born out of community action to save the 14th century Carthusian monastery at Charterhouse. It was left to the people of Coventry in the last owner's will, and everybody sort of forgot that until a for sale sign went up outside, at which point 200 people and their dogs marched on the council house and said to the council, "You can't sell this, it belongs to us." And subsequently, Historic Coventry Trust in an earlier form was set up to find a new future for Charterhouse. Shortly afterwards, we signed a groundbreaking framework agreement with the City Council, under which they transferred 22 historic buildings in council ownership to the Trust. And we have to raise the money, find new uses, carry out repair projects, and then look after that estate in perpetuity. So we're probably 70% through a £25 million construction programme, desperately trying to get all our properties open for City of Culture Year, despite COVID and all the other things that have been hitting us. So this picture just shows you a selection of part of our estate. Today, I just want to focus on the ones that are related to the High Street, but the second column middle picture, for those of you who aren't familiar, is Coventry's Charterhouse. We'll be opening in the autumn, so do please come back. It's going to be a visitor attraction, is supported by the lottery. Bottom left-hand corner is one of our high street projects. This is Priory Row Cottages, which we're converting to visitor accommodation. It's right at the top of the Burgess that I'll be talking about in a minute, and is being supported by the Architectural Heritage Fund. Also on the bottom row next to it, we've got one of the city gates that we're converting to holiday cottages. We've then got Draper's Hall, which is right next to the old cathedral, which will be a new music venue. And next to it on the bottom right is Draper's Bar, which is opening as an exhibition, an urban room and a restaurant later this month. But moving on to the High Street and historic buildings and culture. Owain mentioned that we became the national demonstrator project for the High Street Heritage Action Zone programme in May 2019. And this is focused on the Burgess and Hale Street, which are, even using David's definition, one of the very few traditional surviving high street areas within the city of Coventry rather than in the suburbs. The Burgess is a medieval street running north from the old marketplace. It's now a conservation area and has a number of locally listed buildings, but but it's for long had problems with antisocial behaviour, with crime. The buildings are in poor condition, and there's been little or no planning enforcement, and also had a really bad reputation as somewhere that there was lots of violence and challenging behaviour. So somewhere that definitely needed that intervention that Owain was talking about. We put our first scaffolding up in mid-February and then mid-March 2020. So Historic England had said to us that the demonstrator needed to be all completed by end of March 2020. Now that was never going to be possible, but we said we'd give it a damn good try. Obviously, a global pandemic later added extra challenges, but we have now finished the first phase of that work, which has essentially been the restoration of the buildings on the street frontages of Hale Street and the Burgess. And these pictures show you the before and after of Hale Street. It is worth saying that 60% of the buildings in the High Street house actually belong to Coventry City Council and are passing to Historic Coventry Trust under our framework agreement. So this was really helpful in getting the work done rapidly, because obviously we had control, landlord control over the majority of the buildings. And certainly all the ones apart from the far left that you see on Hale Street are in the council's ownership. The other thing I just want to stress at this point is the model that we've used for delivery. So this hasn't been us giving grants to individual owners. What we've done is we've essentially done 2 large construction programmes run by Historic Coventry Trust. We've employed the contractors, we've employed the architects, we put in a single global planning application for the whole scheme. And that meant that all tenants had to do was agree to give us access to their buildings, and all the private owners had to do was sign a development agreement to agree the changes to their building and agree that they would pay their 25% of it. So essentially we've taken all of the strain from the owners in terms of employing the architects and going out to procurement and all of that. The other part is Burgess and Burgess, which you can see some before and after pictures of here. It's worth saying one of the critical parts of what we've been doing has been the partnership, both with Coventry City Council, but also with the Coventry bid, which is an incredibly active and energetic bid. And they really helped us build those relationships very quickly and very early with all the businesses on the street. In terms of impact, it's worth saying that 6 businesses, despite the pandemic, took the opportunity to do a full internal refurbishment. And on the bottom left picture, towards the right-hand side, you'll see a double frontage called Downtown, which is actually a bar. The owner, the tenant of that, spent over £100,000 completely refurbishing the inside and putting in a kitchen. We also still have independent retailers that want to move to the area. Our only problem is we don't have any vacancies to allow them to move in. So in a way, it's a pity we don't have those vacancies, because there are some great ones queuing up that want actually to be part of this scheme on the Burgess. And on Hale Street, a new business opened last month after having been closed all the way through lockdown. And that's now selling ice creams and desserts, very much appealing to the student market, which is obviously really important in the city. I just wanted to move on a bit to City of Culture and that role of culture in regeneration of the High Street. I have to say we're incredibly lucky in having City of Culture. I think it's going to be much more challenging for other places to bounce back without that focus and that attention. But really, the importance of City of Culture is not just about the events and activities that are happening. it's about changing perceptions of the city. And I think especially post-COVID, where we're now anticipating most of the visitors will be regional visitors or national at the most, we're not going to get the international footfall. But what we discover when we take people around Coventry is that everybody says, I never knew it was like this. And in a really positive way. They all have negative perceptions of the city, which just aren't borne out when you take the effort to come and have a look around. So City of Culture is that real opportunity for us to change perceptions nationally and internationally of what the city is all about. It's also created a real energy and excitement within the city and has been a stimulus to creating new partnerships, which I think it's given a deadline, it's forced people to work together, it's forced people to put aside all the sort of politics and inter-organisational rivalries that are there in normal times, because there is just this big deadline that everybody has to go for. Coventry City Council has also invested hugely in the public realm, and one of the things that they've done is put brand new planting, strip out lots of buildings that had started to colonise those big public precincts, and it is just looking fantastic. So do take the chance to come whenever you can. We haven't finished with the High Street has. The next thing we're moving on to is creating a new public space in Palmer Lane. Now the picture on the right, just to orientate you, the road running north-south is the Burgess. The road at the bottom running east-west is Hale Street. And Palmer Lane is this sort of central block behind the buildings. It's a deeply historic part of the city. It's called Palmer Lane because of the palms that pilgrims used to carry on the pilgrim route. And it also contains the only visible stretch of the River Sherborne in the city centre, which you can see the river bank in the picture on the bottom left-hand side. But it has become a haven for antisocial behaviour, for crime, drug dealing, got loads of bins. It's a huge taxi rank and delivery place for all the surrounding businesses. So at the moment, it's not a place that you'd ever choose to come down here. Just to explain for the next slide, take a look at the picture on the right hand side at the funny shaped building with a red car next to it. It's a sort of half hexagon. That's going to appear in our next pictures. The other thing that's worth saying is that there have been very long held aspirations to deculvert the river from the Coventry Society, the City Council and many others in the city. So keeping the eye on that funny shaped building, you'll now see that at the heart of a new public realm, which is a partnership project between Historic Coventry Trust and Coventry City Council, and is part grant aided through the High Street Heritage Action Zone. And we're going to be deculverting the river, renaturalising the river banks and creating a series of seating terraces down to the river. We're also putting in a suds rain garden, pedestrianising the area, and then at each of the entrances to Palmer Lane is an opportunity for some kind of artistic intervention. These are just placeholders at the moment, and we're working with Coventry City Council on a sort of curated programme. We'll also be converting that central building to a bar cafe and then doing some development of our own on a gap site to again get more retail and restaurant units to give people a reason to go down there, and also creating a riverside beer garden for the Coventry Cross. So just to give you a bit of a flavour of what it might look like, that funny shaped building is right in the centre of the picture there, and you can just see the culvert then going off and disappearing under to Pool Meadow. So the idea is that we create a really nice place for people to sit. It'll also be a public amphitheatre that we can have activities at, and naturalise and green as much as possible, which is why we're calling it that green and blue oasis. But of course, it's not enough to build somewhere and just hope that everything will change and people will come. There's got to be activity. And this is all part of a concerted effort to make sure that we change how people perceive the space and behave in it. Core part of that is this Coventry River Cultural Consortium. We were very fortunate to get a grant from Historic England, the Heritage Fund and the Arts Council as part of the High Street Heritage Action Zone cultural programme. So
1 minute left, Carol.
Thank you very much. We've got a partnership of all the key cultural organisations in the city, and we'll be rolling out an annual Palmer Lane Festival and a series of First Fridays. And we're also working with geographers at the university to measure impact in terms of water quality and air quality. A wider part of the cultural programme is that we've got a photographic residency with Grain Projects as part of the national programme. We're also working with City of Culture and the Bid on the Coventry Show Windows project, and with Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, who are working on the River Sherborne. And the picture you see there is one of our lottery funded projects at the City Gates, which is just around the corner in Lady Herbert's Garden, where we had a fantastic picnic with live music just a couple of weeks ago. And there are other things coming, we hope, with City of Culture, some very exciting projects they're looking to host on Palmer Lane, but they're all incredibly secret at the moment, and we hope to unveil in the future. So thank you very much for listening. Please do follow us on all our social media, have a look at our fairly brand new website, and do come to Coventry whenever you can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. That's fascinating. I've not been to Coventry in quite a few years, and I can't wait for November when the HTN conference takes place there to come and have an explore. And you've already said that you'd like to take us on a tour of the Heritage Action Zone, so I can't wait. Thank you so much for that. We're going to move on now to Joe Holyoak from Moseley Road, Bath, who I know is going to mention Coventry a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Let's try the screen sharing. What's happening?
Just go down to the bottom, Joe, and click on the PowerPoint icon in your tray at the bottom.
Visible.
There we go. And just start.
Is that
your
visible
slideshow.
now?
Yeah, if you just start your slideshow, that's
okay.
Fine.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Owain, I think, has demonstrated that there is a causal effect between architectural conservation and all I've got a couple of case studies that I think demonstrate this process. Before I get on to that, a word about vocabulary. There's a word that I use quite a bit when I'm talking about old buildings which have survived for a very long time and gone through a variety of uses, and that word is persistence. It's an odd word to use. I got it from this book. I don't know what it is in the original Italian, but Rossi uses the word persistence to indicate a kind of permanence of buildings as part of the city's urban fabric, which he says is very important indeed. And I think David, in his introduction, mentioned the importance of permanence as well. And the model which Rossi uses for persistence is the Palazzo della Ragione in Padua, which was completed in 1219. So it's over 900 years old, which is as close to permanence as we can expect, I think, from an urban building. And the ground floor plan, which has housed for hundreds of years the city's market, has existed in this form since 1425. So this is his model for persistence. there's also an economic purpose, an economic importance of old buildings as well, which Jane Jacobs, in her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, underlines. She talks about the importance of urban diversity, which is a key attribute of cities, which the planning process, I think, finds very difficult to deal with and very difficult to generate. And very often what town planning does is to achieve the ironing out of diversity, generating more uniformity. But Jacobs has 4 conditions for generating diversity. And the third one is the importance of having a number of old buildings that vary in age and condition. And it's nothing to do with architectural conservation. It's an economic argument. She says that new businesses in particular depend upon having a supply of old buildings which give affordable accommodation. And she says old ideas can sometimes use new buildings. New ideas must use old buildings. And I think planning authorities are generally very slow to take this key idea on board. They're so anxious to replace the old with the new in many cases that they ignore the economic imperative of having old buildings. This is my first case study, Moseley Road Baths in Birmingham, an Edwardian building. It's grade 2 star listed, as is Balsall Heath Library next door to it with the clock tower on the right. It was for decades threatened with closure by Birmingham City Council, and there was a very extended resistance to these closure proposals, and a community group of which I'm one of the trustees, a CIO, a charitable incorporated organisation, took over the management of swimming at the baths from the City Council 3 years ago. And we're part of what we call the consortium, which has key members besides ourselves of the National Trust, Historic England, the World Monuments Fund, and the City Council, because we have essentially, with the consortium's help, turned round the opposition of the council, and they are now an active part of the consultation, the consortium. This is the original floor plan of the building. It has 2 baths, the first class or gala pool bath on the right of the plan, which has been closed since 2003. And the one active pool is the second class pool on the left, which continues to be open. On the street front at the bottom of the screen are the washing baths, which are a remarkable survivor. They have persisted in Ross's terms, even though they've been out of use for nearly 20 years. 46 washing baths, male and female. But 75% or so of the building is currently empty and unused. And our plan is to regenerate the whole of the building, bring it all back into accommodation, into active use. We have a marvelous book that was published, written by Steve Beauchamp. Its title is significant, I think, Pool of Memories, because Moseley Road Baths is a monument, which we generally use to denote a building which is just very old. But it's important, I think, to remind ourselves of the origin of monument. It comes from the Latin monere, to remember. So a monument is a building which helps us to remember the past. And Steve's book is a wonderful document because it's not only an architectural history of the building, it's also a social history, an oral history of people who've worked there, people who've swum there, their children and grandchildren who've learned to swim there. And so it's a real monumental building in that respect. This is our long-term plan to develop the baths and bring it back into 100% use, putting water back into the gala pool, turning the second-class pool, top left, into a multi-purpose events space, linking with the library next door, including a cafe. We reckon it's a £31 million budget that we need. And we're some way into that, a long way to go yet. But the key importance of the process is that it is community-based. Here we are a few years ago planning the future of the baths in the empty gala pool. And we're currently part of a proposal which we've made for a cultural activity zone on Moseley Road, which is being promoted by the LEP. We hope to get funding to be part of that cultural activity zone activity. We have, this is from a couple of years ago, a film show in the second class pool with spectators actually floating in the water. Not entirely a new idea, because during the Second World War, when they couldn't afford to heat and use the pools during the winter months, the second class pool was boarded over and dances were held there with a dance band, and those are very popular local events, and we'll be doing something like that in the future, we hope. And last year, which unfortunately got stopped when the pandemic arrived, we had a wonderful installation in the empty gala pool by local artist Juno Projects, which involved paintings by hundreds of participants who each contributed one frame to their marvelous film of swimming at the baths. My second case study is a building in Coventry, which is not such an historic building of heritage importance as the baths, but it's still a very good high street building. It's old enough to be historic, built in the late 1950s, and sits very well on its street corner. Locally symbolic because it was the headquarters of the city's daily newspaper until the newspaper moved out in 2012. And it is now converted into the Telegraph Hotel, which opened last year. A remarkably good piece of architectural conservation and reuse, I think. But in between the closure of the newspaper, sorry, not the closure of the newspaper, but the closure of the building and the emigration of the newspaper to another building elsewhere, in between there were a whole series of meanwhile uses. This is the just to illustrate one fragment of the conversion into the hotel. This is the Lightwell converted into the hotel restaurant in a rooflit atrium. But there are a whole series of meanwhile uses of various cultural types. A wonderful pop-up gallery and art space which was incorporated into the building, which is quite typical, I think, of what's happened in many cases in which artists have moved into a disused building and brought about a regeneration with the minimum of financial means, but have increased the value of the building through that cultural appropriation. And in particular, the newsroom, after the newspaper vacated it, was turned into what looks like a marvelous picture gallery. I never visited this, I have to admit, but in many ways it's a great shame that this pop-up gallery is no longer there, but it certainly served a purpose of revitalizing the disused building and keeping it an active place on Corporation Street in Coventry. And I think it's significant to note that much as I dislike in many ways the idea of branding, that the generation of branded products is a very encouraging sign for buildings like these, because it means that it demonstrates that the building has transcended its function and has attained a wider cultural identity. And I think this is something which is to be encouraged. I'm drawing to an end. This is a quotation from Aldo Rossi's book, in which he emphasizes, in writing about persistence and permanence, he emphasizes the fact that the Palazzo della Ragione, which he is citing, the various functions which it takes on over the centuries are entirely independent of its form, which is entirely, that idea is heretical in terms of conventional architectural theory. It was heresy to the theory which I was taught as a student architect, that form follows function. But it forms the first of what I think are 4 key lessons from these case studies, that if a building is robust, and I think robustness is another key term, an essential characteristic of a building which is going to survive as a permanent institution, then the function is largely independent of its form. The building can accommodate different uses through its life. Secondly, the Jane Jacobs point that old buildings have paid off their capital costs and so can be much more flexible in their affordable uses. It can allow activities to take place within them which simply wouldn't be possible in a new building, which has to earn much more money in order to pay for its capital expenses. And another point that Rossi makes, which is that buildings which persist become no longer merely buildings, but by being permanent or near permanent, they become part of the fabric of the city, landmarks, if you like, around which the shape of the city rotates. And lastly, they become monuments. This is difficult to quantify its importance. It's a kind of psychological point more than anything else. They become monuments, that is, artifacts which help us to remember the past and establish a continuity on the high street. So those are my 4 key lessons that I draw from these 2 case studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. All I can say is thank goodness for persistent buildings and the persistent people who rescue and restore them as well. That was a great presentation. We're going to move on to Diane Dever, who comes to us from the Urban Rooms Network and Folkestone Fringe. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody this morning. So I'm just going to share my screen. Is that all good?
That's great.
Okay, excellent. So thanks for the introduction, and yes, I'm here as the chair of the Urban Rooms Network, which is something that came out of this way. Oops, sorry guys. That's why I'm at the end. So for those of you that don't know about the Urban Room Network, it's an initiative that came out of the Farrell Review, which took place in 2013. And that really was a coming together of professionals across the country to look and think about how architecture was taught. And as you can see here from this slide, how the built environment has been dealt with by government has been a sort of quite a sort of elaborate lineup of different departments and different responsibilities. and perhaps therefore not so surprising that some of our built environments and cities and town centres aren't the best they could be. And if you just sort of put this in comparison to how the Treasury, the Home Office and the Cabinet Office have over many, many years just been stable entities. I found that that diagram quite interesting. And from the Fowler Review, there were 5 things that were identified as being important when rethinking how architecture is sort of taught through schools and then how that works through councils and sort of private development. So education and outreach, design quality, cultural heritage was a really important point in that study, economic benefits that come from it, and then obviously built environment policy. And this review is available online. And the things that really interested me about that were this idea of the civic. And so how, as cities and towns and neighbourhoods, we can start to really think about what it means to be civic and how that can permeate through all areas of thinking. And then specifically how we can start to get students at a very young age, but also all the way through to sort of, you know, MA, PhD level, to really start to think about place throughout. And of course, how important the public realm is in all of that, because actually, you know, these are the containers of our lives. So the Urban Room was an initiative that Terry Farrell felt was important and exists in other countries, actually, China, Eastern Europe, this idea of a physical space that people can come to think and talk about the future of their town, but specifically by understanding its past and how that past plays out in the present. So what shapes how things happen today and perhaps where those decisions were made. And of course, that can go back to geology and geography, as well as sort of socio-economic and historic changes. And that review, I mean, it kind of came into being 2013, 2014. And from that, a proliferation of urban room initiatives have started around the country. Some were pop-ups, some are present, as you can see in this map, and some are upcoming. And what's interesting about this initiative is each urban room is different. So they kind of come into being in relation to what's happening locally, you know, the sort of context that drives them. And there are really sort of 3 types: those that are university-led, those that are kind of what I'd say independent-led, so the one I have in Folkestone, so more community-based, arts-focused, and then initiatives that are come out of councils. The 4 examples I've got up here are some of the key ones in the network. So LiveWorks in Sheffield is a university-run initiative right in the middle of the high street. The one in Reading they've had a pop-up one, and now they're moving actually into a shopping centre, and that's part of a local bid. The one in Tyneside in Newcastle actually hasn't quite opened yet, but that's going to be a significant contribution to the urban room network, and that is another university programme. And then the one in Croydon, which just won some awards, was a pop-up one also in a shopping centre, and that was set up initially to help consult on their local plan. And this really simple diagram explains what I would call the underlying principles of an urban room. So some may say, you know, this is a similar initiative to the architecture centres, and I would agree with that. And obviously the legacy of architecture centres sits with us. But this idea of, it's just, the way I describe it is this table with 3 legs. And if one of those legs aren't in place, then the urban room isn't active. And so one of the legs are your decision makers, your stakeholders, your local government, the people who've got power locally. The other one are professionals, practitioners, students, you know, the people that focus on this as a sort of, you know, perhaps work or a passion, but, you know, some sort of knowledge that comes from focused thinking, I think. And then the other is the public. And really the challenge is how you invite the public into this conversation. And so the one in Folkestone has had 3 locations actually, and its current one is in the former Tourist Information Centre. The second one, which was commissioned for the Folkestone Triennial, which I'll come on to, was in the historic Customs House building. And it's interesting that, I mean, it's quite by chance it became to be in the Tourist Information Centre, but this sort of legacy of use, I think, is quite interesting. And in it, It has a series of tables, furniture that was designed by artists that can be set up in different configurations so that can host different types of conversations. And on the wall there is something called the urban analysis. Now, the urban analysis is something that was commissioned in 2014. And for us, it is the kind of foundational document. And it's really a study of what makes the town how it is. And usually master planners do this when they come into a new area and they get old maps and they overlay them. And often places don't change much quickly, but usually something happens so in Coventry, you know, the road network will have changed how Coventry functioned dramatically. In Folkestone, it was the railway. When the railway came in the 1850s, it completely changed the town. It went from a population of sort of 4,000 or 5,000 up to you know 10, 15 in a really short space of time. And of course, that just carried on. And if you look at the railway here, there are only 3 points. This is a pedestrian, 4 points that you can actually pass through that railway. So it completely condensed the landscape, you know, the urban landscape. And that's quite interesting. Of course, you don't really realize that until someone kind of points it out, even though you're moving through the city or the town all the time. And then another factor of how this town was laid out are there are lots of cul-de-sacs, lots of ends of roads, which means the sort of permeability is challenging how one space connects to another. And of course, it's a valley. So, you know, what feels really close pedestrian-wise is actually quite far if you're in a car. And then this is our one-way system, a legacy of the ferry, which hasn't been here for, you know, 25 years. And of course, this is still in the too difficult box and would require government intervention. And in the meantime, we're sort of driving round in circles, and people that come to the town by train and jump in a taxi think, you know, the taxi drivers are taking the mick when they try to bring them down to the harbour. And then the other thing about an urban analysis, it looks at what's coming. You know, what are the development opportunities? What are the sites that are available? And of course, we have got a big development happening on our seafront, which is part of a sort of 20-year period of work. Was initially supposed to be a university campus. And in 2007, 2008, when that crash happened, the university started to contract, and that land was laying dormant for a long while, and now has got a big building project taking place. And what's interesting is when that outline planning permission was given in 2018, it was a derelict site that everybody hated. Now it looks like a beautiful beach waiting to be developed, and nobody wants it to happen. All the newer arrivals feel like their beautiful beach has been taken away. And that's something about timescales, which was touched on earlier. You know, what feels right now or what feels wrong now may have felt right before, and how you kind of bring people into that ongoing conversation. Just quickly, so our urban room works through art and art strategies. This is the derelict train line that runs down to the harbour, and the red bit is inaccessible. And we wanted to try and get people in to sort of reimagine how that train line could be used. And of course, we mentioned earlier, asking people to tell stories, you know, asking people what the city of tomorrow might be and what the city of the future should look like. And the cycle track, the rail track cycle path idea came up. And we invited an artist to help us think about a way to engage people in this idea. And he came up with the idea of the Grand Plaza Express. So building on this idea of, you know, you come to Folkestone, you get off the train, you're on holiday, you know, the sort of heyday of the 60s or the 70s. And we gave out rail ballast. So you had to bring in something to exchange, and we had made an urban archive, and you went away with a piece of rail ballast, original sort of track material. And we built 2 train carriages as a way of getting people to reimagine what that future could be and ran them down the track. And, you know, that took ages of negotiation with Railtrack. It was a complete nightmare. But in the end, we got there, and we still have these carriages now, and actually they're going off to Conus Biennial in a month's time. But it's a kind of key way of engaging people, you know, getting them to think about what a different future might look like. And so just talking about the town generally, so I'm moving into the High Street area now. Our town is made up of a few different areas. Our High Street is really long, and we've got two High Streets, not one. So we've got the old High Street and then the new High Street, and all of the, you know, the sort of complexities of pedestrianisation, thin cobble streets, all of this exists in quite a drawn out sort of situation. And this is just another way of looking at it. Now, the Creative Quarter, which is at the top of that map, was probably the first bit of real placemaking thinking that happened here, and that started in 2005. And all of these properties are actually given in trust for £1 a year to Creative Folkestone, which is a creative placemaking charity. So all of these buildings were purchased over a 5 to 10 year period, completely redeveloped. They probably still aren't worth the money that was put into them, and are now in trust for 100 years, or I mean, it's 85 years now, at £1 a year. And so the income that's generated from those buildings then pays for the cultural programme, the Folkestone Triennial, the book festival, you know, the kind of heart and soul of Folkestone's current cultural identity. And this is how I remember it. And of course, this is how it looks now. And you know, they've really been careful about how those places have been regenerated. I mean, you can see already the detail still existing in the sort of the grain of the buildings. And you know, I remember when these were being done up and were not occupied. It's been a long road and lots of failed businesses, you know, people going in and coming out. The general economy, obviously, over the last 10, 15 years has been challenging, but it is fully occupied now, and there is a wait list, and those rents are protected. And above those shops are artist studios and artist accommodation. And so even though around us now, the town's housing market is going crazy because of people moving down from London, because of COVID, because of the high-speed train, there is a sort of protected central zone where, you know, in years to come, people should still be able to afford to be an artist here, or a small business owner. And then more recently, the district council has invested in something called a place plan. And there are a few missions that have come out of that. And the town centre has obviously come out very clearly and strongly in that as need for attention, because our pedestrianised zone had, you know, all of the big department stores that you can think of, and the future of that is looking really, and there is a lot of empty shops there. And one of their missions is a place for all voices. So these, you know, this was a period of work, a period of talking to lots and lots and lots and lots of people, and the 5 missions came out of it. And the 5th one is access to opportunity. So you talk about partnerships, it feels like the work that the Creative Folkestone have done has been one big chunk of thinking about one part of the town. There's another area called the Harbour, which is also being looked at and redeveloped, and that's by private businessmen. I mean, there's a bigger story there in Folkestone, and now we're finally coming to the sort of the heart of the town centre. And these are some of the big buildings that have been identified as key to the success of its future. And
1 minute left, Diane.
Thank you. We're still in kind of early days about how this gets rolled out, and you know, it needs buy-in from all parties. You know, it's going to be a sort of long haul. But if you look at the building here, it says 2.7. This is what's known locally as Folker, and I'm not too sure why, but anyway, it's currently the COVID vaccination centre because the council bought it. It was Debenhams. It used to be Debenhams, and the council came in and bought it because they believe it is a key site to the success of the future of the high street, and it's the beginning of the pedestrianised zone. And there is a plan for residential, health, retail, and the ground floor and the lower floor are as yet unidentified opportunities. So that's the big conversation that's happening here now locally. you know, what should that activity look like and that animation? And I wouldn't be surprised if the urban room moves into the town centre. And that's one of the views of that building. It's quite a key, you know, the bus station's sort of just behind it. It doesn't feel like this at the moment, I have to say. And then another one at the bottom, the other end of that stretch of pedestrian is another building, which is a sort of 60s, very modern frontage. Again, has a retail store that's probably not going to be there for much longer. And we feel like these are the two key bookends, if you like, of that part of the town. So yeah, lots of work to do, but it's great here because people really are around the same table. And I think, you know, we all know, we talk about Coventry and the City of Culture and what that's doing and how that's moving past, you know, camps, if you like, of sort of different agendas. It is really, really key. And the triennial for us has been a complete driver in reimagining in town and also external perception of what Folkestone is. So that's it. So if anyone listening thinks they might want an urban room in their place, that's the address. You can get in touch with me. We're always happy to talk. Our next urban room meeting will be in Folkestone on the 22nd of September, and it will be our first real live one since COVID. That's it.
Thank you so much, Diane. I think everyone will agree. Those photos of the high street and the colours, how vibrant it looks. What a transformation. And such an interesting juxtaposition as well between your one-way system, which looks like a migraine, and the visions for the derelict railway track. It's really interesting. And it was also great to hear from Carol earlier that Coventry's getting an urban room as well. Brilliant. So thanks, Diane, and we'll next move on to our last speaker, who is Claire Appleby from the Theatres Trust. Take it away, Claire.
Many thanks, Bev, and hello everybody. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. So I'm Claire, I'm the Architecture Advisor at Theatres Trust, and I'm going to cover more about the specific role and benefit of theatres on our high streets and in our town and city centres. For those of you who don't know the Theatres Trust, just a very brief background. Theatres Trust is the national advisory public body for theatres, set up by set up by the government through an Act of Parliament in 1976. And we work to promote the protection of theatres for the benefit of the nation. We were actually established in the direct response to a terrible loss of theatre buildings throughout the country. So in the 60 years prior to the establishment of Theatres Trust, over 800 theatres had been lost throughout the country. So a terrible devastation of our theatre heritage. Many of those theatres were situated in town or city centres, where the sites were considered better for more profitable uses, such as office buildings, retail, or even housing. Now it's much more unusual to see our theatre buildings lost. It does still happen. There are still developments which are pushed ahead. We've recently fought a case at planning for the Savile Theatre in London. So the Savile Theatre is now the Odeon Cinema on Shaftesbury Avenue. And the owner was looking to convert that to hotel residential use. It was taken to planning appeal, where we supported the local council in fighting that and to retain its cultural use, which was very successful, which is fantastic. And we hope that we can continue to help battle for our historic buildings in our town and city centres. We're a statutory consultee on theatres in the planning system. We also operate as a charity. We provide advice on the design, planning, development and sustainability of theatres, campaign on behalf of theatres old and new, and offer financial assistance through our grant schemes. I'm just going to move down to the next slide. And on here, you can see some statistical data relating to our work. We're just a small team. There is only 10 of us, but we work throughout the UK, and that's with theatre owners and organisations, local authorities, campaign groups, and all to better protect our unique heritage of theatre buildings. So when I say unique heritage of theatre buildings, this includes buildings both historic and new, which are in current use as theatre buildings, which numbers over 1,000. Buildings built as theatres, but in other alternative uses. So for example, bingo halls, nightclubs, places of worship, that kind of thing. And also those that are currently vacant and semi-derelict, often waiting for new use, or sadly where current owners are hoping to redevelop the site. So why are theatres important? Well, theatre and theatre buildings are an important part of our social and architectural history, from those opulent and highly decorative theatres of the 19th century to the streamlined Art Deco interwall theatres, the civic architecture of the post-war years to the black box theatres of the 70s and 80s. And on the screen there you can see some kind of classic examples: the London Coliseum by Frank Matcham, the auditorium in the top left corner, Theatre Royal in Newcastle in the top right, and down to Peter Morrow's 1980s interior for the Theatre Royal down in Plymouth. And in the bottom left there is Eden Court in Inverness, which is a Category A listed building. And now to pick up on something that Joe was talking about, flexibility and adaptation of buildings, which is really, really important. So as well as purpose-built theatres, there are those that theatre organisations that have found homes in other historic buildings and really serve to help protect these historic assets. So some of you may know the Roundhouse in Camden, which was a former engine shed built in 1847 to specifications of George Stephenson, and originally housing an engine turntable for the London and Birmingham Railway, now of course a live performance venue. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the Royal Exchange in Manchester, a modern 7-sided theatre pod which is constructed of glass and steel and is suspended inside the 19th century former Cotton Exchange. The top right-hand corner is St George's Theatre in Great Yarmouth, which is a Grade 1 listed 18th century deconsecrated chapel. It was considered under great threat until its conversion to theatre certainly helped protect and save the building. There are also the more unusual conversions, such as the Accidental Theatre in Belfast, which is a fringe theatre located on a former bank on Belfast Shaftesbury Square, or in the bottom right-hand corner there, you can see the Phyllis Maud performance space outside Newport, which in its former life was a public toilet. It's now a small theatre with an audience capacity of around 25 to 30. And of course, not to forget, in Coventry, you have the Shopfront Theatre run by Theatre Absolute, which is in an old fish and chip shop in the City Arcade. Just to pick up on something that Joe said a little bit earlier about kind of meanwhile use of buildings, we also see quite a lot of theatre or immersive theatre in some of our historic high street buildings. So these are uses which they utilise those empty buildings and really help reanimate them and revitalise them just for that short period of time. So, for example, there's the Great Gatsby, which is currently an immersive theatre just off Bond Street in London, and Theatre Delicatessen have used buildings throughout Sheffield. Moving on, so as well as that architectural importance of the buildings is the community importance and benefit of our theatres. And that's anything from the personal connections and fond memories of the past, a little bit as Diane and Joe were talking about earlier. So people who have fond memories of family members performing on that stage, memory of a first date maybe at the theatre, or a venue where parents or grandparents went to see some famous historical band or performance, maybe Charlie Chaplin, first performance of the Beatles, right through to the role that theatre plays in our community today. Theatre so often sits right at the very, very heart of our communities, and we now use theatre buildings in a wide variety of ways. So today, throughout the UK, people come to theatre to see a live performance, to visit with their school, to participate in a community event, or simply to socialise, have a cup of tea and a natter. A vast majority of theatres are involved in a range of educational projects, in talent groups, in wellbeing or other social impact initiatives, and often through underrepresented groups. The importance of theatre to community has really been borne out through the role that they've played in their communities throughout the pandemic. So from putting their skills to use in making protective equipment from the NHS, through to making their buildings available as vaccination centres, setting up services to help those most isolated in their communities, through to online youth classes and performances for schools. And I'll come to that a little bit later on in the talk. But first, I want to just talk very briefly about the role of theatre to its local economy, and also in creating vibrant places where people want to come to live and to work. Theatre buildings are often prominent and focal on our high streets. Even if you haven't been inside, they really help shape our towns and cities and form our urban landscapes. Most often it's in a positive manner. In the top left images of Sheffield theatres, with the Crucible in the left, the modern building on the left, and then the Lyceum, which form kind of the public square. And on the bottom left is Morecambe Winter Gardens, which is a landmark building on Morecambe Bay and currently being restored. However, sometimes these buildings have fallen derelict and unloved for years, and it can be quite the opposite, with people really not realising that behind this deteriorating facade can lie something quite spectacular, that with energy and enthusiasm, passion, a bit of time and money, can actually provide a real valuable asset to its community. And on the right of the screen, you can see some images of Burnley Empire, which is an old Bertie Crew building in the heart of Burnley, is now getting some high street, has funding to restore and repair it. And you can see behind that very derelict facade, there's quite a fantastic interior, which is the picture on the bottom right. Theatres are often anchors to places. They act as a draw for potential new tenants and for developers. And often now they act as hosts for other cultural and community organisations, so forming community arts hubs. Many theatres have reconfigured their spaces to allow daytime access to the general public, make them available as a community resource. And together, all of these activities really help create a sense of cohesion and pride in place for local residents and workers alike. I'm just going to put a bit of a monetary figure on this now. So Arts Council England, DCMS and Nesta recently commissioned research on the contingent value of culture and heritage. So that's the value that people place on our culture and heritage. It noted that people have placed a value on keeping their local theatre in their city at over £13 a year. So that's not to go and visit it, that's just to have it in their city. The same report also noted that households on average value the historic character of their local high street at around £7.80 a year. And there's other figures as well relating to other historic civic buildings. Now, we applied the specific theatre data there to some research that we were carrying out on the impact of funding, repair, upgrade and fit out of 50 theatres across the UK. And applying this data, it was estimated that the population, and that's both theatre visitors and non-theatre visitors, if you like, would place an annual value of 9.6 million across these 50 theatres as cultural assets within their local communities. So quite a large sum there. There's also a tangible positive benefit that theatres have on their local economy. So theatres are often focal points, attracting visitors to a place, increasing footfall and encouraging spend locally. And that's both by local communities and by tourists to a place. Data released by UK Theatre estimated that in 2018, the performing arts across the UK attracted more than 34 million visitors, generating ticket revenue of 1.28 billion. These figures don't include the indirect benefits. So in other words, the economic impact on all related hospitality or other related businesses. However, there are estimates and data we can draw on to demonstrate the impact of theatre on its local economy. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. At the bottom right-hand side of the screen is Bradford Odeon. This is a 1930s Sydney variety located in the centre of Bradford on its Centenary Square. In 2009, it was under threat of demolition and the site for reuse as residential. Happily, it's currently being restored and will be reopening, I think it's early next year now. And once reopened, it's estimated to attract around 270,000 event visitors a year to the city. And it's estimated that that will benefit Bradford economy by up to 10 million annually. Now, this is obviously a very large venue. It's about 4,000 capacity standing. So how does that kind of translate to the smaller scale? So the top right is a picture of Spilsby Theatre in Lincolnshire. This is a former sessions house and jail that was converted to a theatre and is located in Spilsby Town Centre. The theatre's currently closed due to structural issues, and the auditorium only seats around 100. But it's estimated that once it reopens, that it will contribute in excess of £500,000 to the local economy each year. Stockton Globe, to the bottom left, is another of our historic kind of 30s theatres, which is currently being restored and is going to be reopening later this year. It's estimated that it's going to increase visitor numbers by £170,000 per year, with up to even a possible £18 million boost to its local economy. Now, of course, those three are just kind of estimated figures. They're examples of estimates. Buildings have yet to reopen. So looking at a current working example, top left is Story House in Chester, which opened in May 2017. The council there have released figures which showed a 15% increase in footfall in Chester city centre in the first year of the building opening, and there were 1 million visitors to the Story House itself. So all of this is really relevant in these times when people, government are desperate to reinvigorate our high streets. There's also growing evidence of the importance of theatre and the arts in improving physical and mental well-being. Arts and culture are critically important to sustaining our health, to helping tackle major social problems like loneliness and isolation, and to building communities. But how do we evidence this? A 2015 report for the DCMS quantified the health benefits enjoyed by people attending a cultural or sporting activity, finding that the NHS saves a yearly total of £11.91 for every person partaking in such activity. So this is from a reduction in GP visits and use of psychotherapy services. Earlier this year, UK Theatre used this data and combining it with data from their audience attendance figures, have estimated that theatres generate an annual cost saving to the NHS of £102 million per year, so greatly helping benefit the physical and mental health of those in their surrounding communities. Arts Council England's report, The Value of Arts and Culture to People in Society, reported that those who'd attended a cultural place or event in the preceding 12 months were 60% more likely to report good health, and theatre goers were 25% more likely to report being in good health than average. To dig down into a couple of specific examples, at the top of the screen are some images of the Old Vic Theatre. It's carried out its own audience survey in which 93% of respondents so far have agreed or strongly agreed that the theatre benefits their mental health and well-being. And the image at the bottom of the screen is of Home in Manchester, who calculated that between 2019 and 2020, the theatre had saved NHS services £1 million, which is huge for that area. This is that figure comes as part of a wider study that Home put together, and where they calculated there that they had a £26 million economic impact on their local city between 2019 and 2020.
Got 1 minute left, Claire.
Thank you, perfect. So many of the theatres that we work with are historic buildings on the high street or in the city centre. So is there a role for historic buildings and cultural uses in high street revival? Yeah, most definitely. And remember, theatre doesn't have to be in a purpose-built theatre building. There are great examples of innovative theatre organisations using and converting historic buildings on our high streets. There really is a clear and established importance of theatres in their local communities, but also an ever-growing role both in supporting health and well-being and in boosting and supporting the local economy and driving footfall back to our high streets. And just to come to the very last slide, very, very quickly, I won't go into too much detail, but this is the slide talking about the role that theatres have played throughout COVID, and to show you how theatres have responded to that crisis and help reach out and support their local communities. I'll just very briefly whiz around the screen. The top left is the Royal Opera House, and there they donated personal protective equipment from its set and scenery workshops to the London Ambulance Service, and you can see them, the costume department, who have been making the PPE there. Top right is the National Opera House, and they use lullabies to help people recovering from COVID-19, with the company employing techniques used by opera singers to aid rehabilitation, so breathing techniques. The middle pictures are of theatres which are converted to vaccination centres, so the Artrix, Bromsgrove on the left, which sadly actually closed during the coronavirus crisis. The theatre organisation folded, but we're hoping there'll be a new organisation taking over. And of Battersea Arts Centre setting itself up as a vaccination centre. And then just finally, very, very quickly, the Yard in Hackney. It was a picture of the guy with the kind of red hat on his head. The Yard in Hackney have been doing a lot of their workshops and performances online, but they've also been incredibly active in their community, coordinating volunteers to deliver food and shopping locally, establishing groups of phone buddies, making calls to the isolated and lonely local residents. And then finally at the bottom, we've got Slumlow, who run the Holyoak and Community Centre College in Leeds, acting as lead organisation, coordinating volunteers to deliver food parcels, prescriptions and laundry. And one of the theatres on our Theatres at Risk list and undergoing their own transformation project to save their building, Leaf Theatre, who've been playing a vital role in their community, opening for food bank donations, collecting materials for masks, and going into partnership with Empty Kitchens Full Hearts, allowing the charity to use their kitchens and one of their auditoria to feed those in need. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. What absolutely fascinating stats on well-being. There's been a couple of questions or a couple of comments in the chat box asking if there's any way that attendees can get access to the stats at all. So I don't know if there's anything you could share with me that I could send out.
Yes, I will share some of those links. The Creative Industries Council has got a very good page which lists the whole load of the stats, but I can also send links to some of those reports.
That would be brilliant. Thank you so much. Right, that's the end of our presentations. Thank you to all of our speakers so far. I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to lead the question and answer session.
Thank you, Bev, and thank you to all our speakers. I think we've been through a sort of incredible variety of speakers and a really useful mix of that big picture, that big historical picture, that evidence-based stuff with some really interesting on-the-ground examples of models for regeneration and models for engagement. So a fascinating morning so far. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Please either put them in the chat box or raise your hand. I'll rely on Bev to keep an eye on who's raising their hand because I can't multitask. But we had a couple of questions earlier, which was, I think, a question to Joe, but others can join in as well. The Baths project is very ambitious. How have you built partnerships engaging with the local community, and what other opportunities are there to bring in new partners from the vicinity?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to build up our local community representation. The origins, as I said, was in community membership. That's where it all started, and we've got a very strong base in our customers, who, in some cases, come considerable distance in order to swim there. They could much more conveniently swim at other bars more local to them. I think we've got some way to go is the answer. And at the same time, we are very dependent upon the resources of the consortium. Big hitters like National Trust and Historic England, we couldn't have got where we are without them. So I think it's very much a question of the complementary nature of those two bodies, really, big institutional hitters and a local community base. And I think we've got some way to go with increasing and really making maximum use of our local community representation.
Thanks, Joe. And I think that's an interesting point about people coming back to the Baths from wider locations. It really reflects that point you made about the monument as a place of memory that people come back to.
Indeed.
And that sort of cultural significance. And I'm reminded of, one of the high streets that I was referencing in Coventry is the Fosel Road, which is an area associated with the South Asian community, but many of the people that originally settled there have become prosperous and moved on to better housing in other parts of the city. But it retains that memory, and it's the place where the sari shops are, and the places where you get food, and the places where you get cooking implements and so on. And so it's even though new communities have occupied it now, the memory is still there, and that's a very recent memory.
Indeed. Yeah.
There was another question which I think was for Diane, which I think Diane has answered in the chat, but I thought it'd be useful for everybody who isn't necessarily following the chat to get you to answer it on screen as well, Diane, about the public consultation, and perhaps this is something that other people can join in as well. The most successful creative approaches to engaging people when a town centre may not feel owned by the community if they don't live there.
So the sort of, I would always, and I said this in the chat, try and take those conversations out onto the streets. And some of the ways that urban rooms design their furniture is in a mobile way. So these sort of, I'm thinking particularly now about Croydon, the urban room in Croydon that was the council initiative, and our one in Folkestone, and actually even in Sheffield. So the mobile furniture is iconic. You know, people relate it back to the urban room. Croydon's was orange, ours is pink, and those tables, or sort of, in our case, they're like steps that you can wheel about. We've even got a big set of steps that you can take out, become kind of identifiers, markers of, oh, these are the types of conversations that are happening now. These are about the future of place. And, you know, really simple things like maps, getting maps out, getting people to find where they live. I mean, models, 3D models are just amazing. Anything that people can really get their head around in terms of putting themselves in it, if that makes sense. And, you know, like post-it notes are brilliant. Getting people to draw is amazing. Postcards for the future, any of those little sort of strategies that take people out of the kind of everyday way of looking at things. And then Croydon did something brilliant. I'm just going to try and share an image. I'm hoping it's not taking too long, but they actually needed to consult on their local plan, which is really dry stuff. And I don't know if you can see this really well, but there are circles of colour, and each colour represented an area. So blue was the economy, green was the environment, orange was strategic objectives, and they were like pamphlets, little three-way kind of fold-out pamphlets. And you came into the urban room, and they took this outside as well, and you said, right, what do you want to think about today? And it might have been the economy, it might have been the environment, it might have been transport. And so people were self-selecting the thing that was of interest to them. And then they were literally given the question that's on the consultation sheet that the council had put out to answer. And then they were asked to put their name down, so they were on the mailing list. And it's a really kind of visual way of getting people to think about specific things, as well as other strategies that artists use for thinking about general things. And then we've got a triennial artwork that we're collaborating in, which we're using the vocabulary of the arcades, which is familiar with folks, and everyone laments, you know, the lost arcades. And we're putting a dome back on the beach in reference to the rotunda, and getting people to play arcade games that talk about the challenges that we're facing. So, you know, migration is a challenge here for us. We're at Brexit town, and so the game you play is, you know, how are you going to get from France to here? Are you going to pay some money? Are you going to try and swim? Are you going to, you know, really tough issues that might just shift people's perspective on what it means to be in that sort of position, but you're doing it through a pinball machine. So if you come to the triennial, you'll be able to experience that yourself.
Excellent, thank you, Diane. And I think there's really important points there about taking the consultation out onto the street and giving it that sort of really striking identity that can engage people. Do we have any other questions? Or do any of our...
Oh, Jonathan Lee's got his hand up.
Jonathan.
Hi, yeah, I just I'm quite interested in discovering whether people have had particularly successful strategies in terms of utilising perhaps semi-derelict space above retail and above other important buildings in the high streets. It's something that clearly leads lots of people to feel threatened, particularly in evenings, because they just don't feel that there's anyone around watching, looking out, able to call for help if required.
Anybody want to come in on that one? Owen.
Well, unfortunately, I can't provide a useful solution because I think it is a problem, and it is a problem recognised at the highest levels of government, and it's something that certainly the Future High Streets Task Force is trying to get its head around, and is also an issue that links into recent planning reform. As things stand, there are limited incentives for those people that own properties on high streets to make better and more efficient use of upper floors. And that's something that could helpfully change, because there are huge opportunities for increasing residential accommodation at a time when we need that kind of accommodation. And as you say, Jonathan, it also has really positive impacts on the high street itself. It lengthens the day in which the high street is an active space, and that has implications on both security but also the type of places that operate in the high street. It is a real problem. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is no real solution, and it also links into the absentee owners issue, which Power to Change in particular has written quite a lot about of late. But it is hopefully something that certainly the task force and certainly MHTLG will start delivering on promises about doing something about. No solution, but I agree it's a problem, which is
it's interesting in Mansfield, where I was working previously, where pre the THI that I was involved in there, where owners had actually invested in previously very poor condition residential units above shops, they were able to attract much better quality tenants on higher rents, people that weren't then inviting lots of other people to come and sublet and so on, which was causing antisocial problems in the town. In Gainsborough, where I'm now involved in the THI, we have similar problems but it's really difficult, I've found, to convince landlords to benefit from a living over the shop grant scheme that West Lindsey District Council offers, for example, because they just think it's too much hassle. So I was really wondering if anyone has had experience of making a go of it. And what I really would love to get is from either a HAS scheme or from the THI some stats that show that I could present to owners and say, here's what happens when you invest in your accommodation. This is the increase in occupancy rate. This is the typical increase in yield, and actually get a body of case studies together that could then be used as a convincing pitch for landlords who just think it's too much hassle and would rather leave them empty.
Can I follow that up offline, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure.
Because we have published previously, although quite some time ago, and it does need updating, Living Over the Shop, that looked at this specific issue. And it's also something as part of the HAS scheme, we've started to think about what can be done with regard from historic England. I mean, there's also issues around access that prevent better utilisation of the floors. But rather than Googling now to try and find what stuff we did produce in Living Over the Shop, it might be easier and save everyone else's time if we followed up after the session, and I can hunt out what we have and involve you in anything we do going forward.
Thank you.
Yes, that's certainly a really quite a challenge, and I think you're right to point to the access issue. And I heard at the IHBC conference a couple of weeks ago, Jan Gell talking about the fact that over the years, historically there was always a separate entrance for the upper part of those high street buildings, and over the years those separate entrances were incorporated into the retail on the ground floor, and we've lost those, and it does then make access issues quite a challenge. Matt, do you have another question, or do you want to come in on that point?
It was just coming in on that, really. I run the Townsgate Heritage Project in Boston, and what we have found is certainly where the opportunity has been there, whilst we don't offer grants, it's sort of enveloping works particularly, you know, but where we have been able to offer grants, it has encouraged and incentivized those owners anyway to develop the upper floors of their buildings independently of that, because and those sort of grant schemes have been the things that have pushed those decisions in the right direction, fortunately. Certainly on one particular unit that's having like a £100,000 sort of shopfront grant, because it's a very substantial building. It's like, and it is one of the ones you've said that is just sort of grown in scale over the years. It's just sort of, it's had that creeping growth of taking in a number of other buildings and sort of then covering medieval alleyways and things like that. And because of that, we have had interest in other property owners wanting to do the same thing. But it's, as Owen and yourself have just mentioned, the key issue is that access. Most of these buildings, certainly in Boston, and I think probably a lot of these densely, you know, populated areas, only have access often to the front, you know, straight through the shop to access the upper floors. So whilst there is some accommodation on some of these buildings now on the upper floors, it's the building occupants, it's the people running the business effectively, using them as live work spaces, which is still a positive. But it's also we often find just sort of general planning issues, bin storage and fire egress and things like that are just preventing it on other buildings. So I think, yeah, it's a definite challenge on those properties. But again, I would be interested in seeing that guidance and hearing more about if there's any ways of overcoming those issues. I think there's an appetite. Certainly I've seen an appetite for people to do it, and maybe if it is incentivized, or there just needs to be the ability to get around these quite significant hurdles.
Thank you. We got a question from Terry from Sailortown in Belfast. Says he's really interested in the Folkestone Place ideas, and they've just completed a streetscape project with Queen's University Architecture Department. Now have lots of ideas, lots of place meanwhile use concepts based on current and ex-residents' inputs. But how do they go about putting those ideas into reality? Anybody want to come in on that? Diane, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reiterate what I said in the chat. These things don't happen quickly, and it's often, it needs passionate people in your town centre or your city to sort of take a leap for you. Some estate agents really understand the dynamic of getting buildings occupied, and if you can work with the charity, you can offer a business owner a business rate relief. It's not something that's used a lot, but it's starting to happen more. The challenge, of course, is people with empty premises often don't want to start negotiating cheaper rents, because those buildings that are on their books are valued at a certain rental income. And so it's important for property portfolios for that income to remain at, you know, the value of that property to remain at that level. So that's why you don't also get rents reduction in high streets, I'm realising. But if you can negotiate a no rent situation, that doesn't affect the value of that property on their books. And they also get business rate relief if you occupy it for, I think, I'm not sure, is it 48 days or 68? But there's a sort of special kind of number there. And so we're starting to try and do that a little bit more here. We're in a fortunate position where It's only really now the big buildings that are unoccupied. All the little ones are sort of taken up, and that's the knock-on effect of 10 years of working in this way. So we're looking at a big space at the moment. Like, it's too big for us really, and the landowner will give it to us rent-free, so it doesn't affect his portfolio price. And I just need to find a charity that's prepared to take the lease on, and that could, you know, that could change that area of town completely. But you need to find the estate agents that want to work on your behalf.
Okay, thanks for that. We have a lot of empty, like you say, small spaces down here. Our main project is working on restoring a historic church, but basically we're really looking to regenerate the whole area. So there's a lot of, and like you say, the rents are expensive, because it's BT1, which would be considered city centre, and there's a huge number. Anyway, I could go on and on about it forever, but that's a good idea. Basically, have the rates relief thing, because we are a charity. So look at that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Good luck.
Thanks.
Yes, that rate relief thing really does depend on the attitude of your local rating authority, and but you can usually get away with it.
Yeah, it's definitely a kind of, but you know, if you've got persistently empty buildings, it's in the interest of your council to want to work with you. They just need to be reminded sometimes.
Yeah, turn a blind eye and let it happen. Yes.
I just pop in there as well. I was talking to the operators of Abbeydale Pitch House in Sheffield only the other day, and they're an organisation. Abbeydale Pitch House is one of their kind of the new parts of their portfolio, but they started out taking on leases, short-term leases on empty properties in the city centre and converting them into artist studios, and they've kind of delved out now, and they're using out-of-town warehouses as well. But very much as Diane was saying, their model there was to offer the owners a bit of rent, so that it could help balance that kind of business rates that they have to pay. So sometimes there's another way around with that private ownership as well. Just a small amount of rent coming in can help them enormously.
Okay, do we have any other questions? It's almost.
Yes, we've got a couple. One from Mandy Martinez. She says access for all to historical buildings can be an issue, especially for ones that are listed. She wonders if the panel has any views on that.
Okay.
I can jump in and talk about theatres if that's of help, because it's one of the major problems with lots of our historic theatres, trying to find access into those. And then it's something you always have to look at closely, and you have to balance the harm to that historic building against the benefit that it's going to give, and that the public access is always trying to find a way to put in a new lift shaft or a new ramped access or something along those lines. And yes, it is tricky, it is difficult. I guess theatre buildings have a little bit more space generally than when we were talking about those high street residential units above shops though, so different issues all round.
Thank you. Was there another one, Bev?
Yeah, we've got a question from Kate Dixon to Carol, asking about bins in town centres. She said, we need more underground bins like they have in Europe. How will they deal with them at Palmer's Lane, Carol?
Yeah, my life is bogs and bins, really. I mean, forget heritage. It's a real problem, not just where people store them, but how frequently they get emptied and how you get the bin lorries in. Actually, a lot of the new developments already have bin stores, they're just not using them. So we will be building bin stores, but then there's a big thing about educating and forcing the people to actually use them, and that's where the council is going to be helping us.
Excellent. Any other thoughts about bins from the panel? It is a persistent issue, and I know a lot of planning discussions tend to get bogged down with discussions about the bins at the end and ignore the big design issues. Is that Jeff? Have you still got your hand up, or have you failed to put it down?
No, my hand's still up. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can. Yes,
yes. My camera seems to have packed in, so you'll have to just take me on voice only. It's more a statement than a question, and that is that we're just about to embark on a large project in Walsall in the West Midlands on a heritage building. We were given a development grant by National Lottery to do an options appraisal, and that was just before COVID struck. And of course, with an options appraisal, we wanted to jump in the car and go up and down the country and visit other sites and talk to other people about their experiences. That hasn't been possible. So I'm just making the point that these forums are of huge value to us. I'll be following up with individuals who are encountering problems that I know we're going to be facing coming up. So it's just a thank you that in the last 2 hours I've learned so much. It's a pity I can't come out and visit, and I'm sure other people are in the same boat, but just thank you for the opportunity to take part and to learn so much in such a short space of time.
Thank you, Jeff. That's a good point at which to say we're now at 12 o'clock, and I really should be wrapping up. I'd like to thank all our speakers. I think we've learnt an incredible lot today. Carol reminded me of what a stabby place the Burges was when I first came to Coventry. I think it was sort of, you know, labelled the murder capital of the country at that time, and it's totally transformed now. And the terms that Joe introduced about persistence, robustness, and monuments being about memory, I think were incredibly useful. And Bev then came in with what might be the title of our conference, I think, which is Persistent Buildings and Persistent People. I think that's a really good one.
Do I get a rise?
Sorry?
Do I get a rise?
Oh, get a bonus maybe. Yes, and I think some really good examples about that. I love the sort of triangular diagram that Diane showed us, and it reminded me of something that I was always saying about the importance of the experts about a place, which are the people that live there and work there, and experts about places, and getting those two together is really important. I think engagement doesn't work if you only do one of those. And I think that was a point really well made. And I'd like to make sure I mention that this is an Architectural Heritage Fund event. They're commissioning these events, and they have funds for investment in High Street, as some of our speakers have mentioned. And for our members, they're often the first point of call for early stage feasibility money and so on. So please remember, in the chats, the Community Ownership Fund was highlighted there, and it's very worth having a look at that, and also funds that are available currently for community-led housing. So please do investigate those. Now, this has been an incredible morning, but if you haven't had enough and you haven't booked yet, there is our workshop this afternoon, Reimagining Our High Streets Beyond Retail. You can still book on that if you haven't booked already. It's being led by Simon Balkin, who's on behalf of Stir to Action, and he's a consultant and researcher with a background in community land trusts and the co-op movements. So that's another opportunity to explore these issues further in a more sort of interactive format. So thank you all very much for coming. It's been an amazing morning. We'll try and pull together as much information we can from the documents and the research that the speakers have mentioned, and do look out for the further events in this programme, which you will be able to attend in person or online. So we're really looking forward to that. And thank you all, and thank you once again to all our speakers. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
David. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.